Test check, 1 2 1 2. Test check, test check. Test check, 1 2 1 2. All righty. Let's go ahead and get started. Jump right in. Father God, we thank you so much for this evening we could spend together, and I pray that you would enlighten our minds, give us wisdom and understanding as we seek to figure out how to better communicate your word, your gospel truth, to evangelize and to share with others who do not know you. And we ask, Lord God, that you would help us to have good conversation and give us wisdom. We thank you for your grace. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so Apologetics Lesson 2. We have done one lesson on apologetics. It's been a while. I actually had to go back in the archives and see when the last one was, and it's definitely been several months. And the first one we did on like a very just accessible introduction to apologetics. You know, how can you share the gospel with your friends, your family, your coworkers, especially when it's, you know, something that is hard to do sometimes. And, you know, oftentimes apologetics can get very philosophical, you can get very analytical, and a lot of people don't respond well to that. So the first one we did on just accessible approach. Does anyone remember what we talked about in that first lesson? Sometimes you gotta wait.
It's a lot of asking questions.
Yes, a lot of asking questions, right? He talks about the Columbo method, right? And asking a lot of questions, getting a sense from people about where they're coming from, their perspective.
And listening and kind of allowing them to shoot holes in their own boat, so to speak. Like,
Yeah.
Where do you get that idea and where does that come from? And getting them to realize that their ideas might not be logical or might not compete with reality or
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so I think that's a great place to start if you don't know apologetics very well, if you're very nervous, all of those things. And to this day, I utilize a very similar approach, especially when I'm starting a conversation with people. However, apologetics is not only for trying to convince people of the truth or the reality of the gospel or Jesus. Although it is partially that, one thing apologetics does as well is it emboldens and strengthens us in our own faith. We begin to realize, oh, there are good, rational reasons for what I believe. You know, many of us come to the faith through some sort of intuition. I've said this many times before, we're not argued into the kingdom. Most people don't come to the Jesus because they're convinced mentally through some sort of argument. But then we begin to get questioned by unbelievers or those who think differently than us, and then we begin to wonder, do I believe something irrational? Is this, not something that a thinking adult should believe? And the reason I'm bringing all that up is tonight we're going to go into a little bit more depth. Now, this is probably one of the most accessible of the formal arguments for the existence of God, okay? So classically, historically, there are many formal arguments for the existence of God. And these tend, again, to get a little bit more philosophical, a little bit harder to follow. Tonight, we're going to touch on the easiest one. So if you're going to run to one argument to argue the existence of God with people, you should probably utilize what we talk about tonight, okay? But sometimes arguing the existence of God isn't even a profitable endeavor to begin with, okay? Sometimes it's assumed by the individual, and sometimes the individual's objection has nothing to do with their belief in God or not, even if they might say it does. So these are the sorts of things that are interesting to follow. I thought about tonight talking about all the standard arguments for the existence of God. It's way too much content, right? So I started to dig into it, and then I thought about talking about the 3 metaphysical arguments for the existence of God. And these 3 come from, this is John Frame's definition. He wrote a really good book on apologetics. And he has 3 different arguments for the existence of God, and they come from different areas, right? The first is the teleological argument for the existence of God, which we will be talking about tonight. And this is the argument from purpose, okay? The argument from purpose. And again, it's the one we're going to be discussing in depth tonight. Then he also has the ontological argument for the existence of God. And this is the argument from being. And then finally, he has the cosmological argument for the existence of God. The cosmological argument for the existence of God. And this is the argument from cause. So then I started to dig into it, and I was like, okay, we'll do the 3 metaphysical arguments for the existence of God tonight. It's too much. There's way too much content, right? So tonight, we're just going to do the teleological argument. One argument for the existence of God, and hopefully, I think that'll help all of us to retain it a little bit better, remember it, and be able to focus on the ideas. If I blasted you with even the 3, I think we'd be going a million miles an hour. You'd end, you'd be like, wow, and then like a week from now, you wouldn't remember any of them. Hopefully, if we focus in on the teleological argument alone, you'll be able to walk away having understood some good content. So that's the idea. That's the idea tonight. Now, again, I want you guys to know that this whole endeavor, arguments for the existence of God, it has a really interesting history. If you guys know the philosopher Immanuel Kant, he came up with his idea of the categorical imperative, which is really important in ethics, the study of right living, ethics and morality. He questions whether or not arguments for the existence of God are even needed, right? He questions the viability for proofs for God's existence. He basically says we shouldn't even really be doing that probably. And, pretty famously, Cornelius Van Til, when he came up with his transcendental argument from the existence of God, which interestingly enough is very similar to some of Immanuel Kant's ideas, he also questions the traditional arguments for the existence of God. There are holes in all of them, okay? There are holes in all of them. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about tonight. So many people have just thrown them all out. and said, okay, there are holes in all the arguments, we're not going to use them. But obviously, if I'm going to teach you one of them, that's not my approach tonight. Go ahead.
When you say that they don't think they're necessary, like they just think like everyone should just believe in the existence of God, or what do you mean by that?
No, so I'll go with Van Thiel's approach because he's the one I'm most familiar with. Van Thiel essentially says because there are holes in all of them, they're logically flawed, every single one of them. They depend upon the presuppositions of the individuals holding to them. We shouldn't use them, essentially, right? He doesn't like them from a philosophical standpoint. He just thinks they're not like a valid approach, because of the presuppositions that you have to believe in order to adhere to them. And that's one of the key things I want to point out, is this idea of the presuppositions underneath all of these arguments, right? Presuppositions. There are certain things you have to already believe for the arguments to make sense. Oftentimes, an argument you find very compelling, you'll share it with somebody, and they'll be like, okay, I think I follow you, but I don't think that matters very much, or that isn't very compelling to me. Oftentimes, it's because you believe something underneath the argument that they don't believe, right? And that's actually Van Thiel's point. He says every one of these arguments requires a prior belief in something else, and if the unbeliever doesn't hold to that, they're not bound to hold to it morally, and so logically, we shouldn't utilize that as a proof, right? I disagree. I've told you guys before in the last one that I take what's called a cumulative case approach to apologetics these days. Cumulative case. And that means I use any argument that I think will be effective. Here's the thing. Some people might be compelled by the teleological argument, even though they don't understand the presuppositions they're holding to, even though philosophically they're not required to, etc. They just might find it compelling. Well, I'm very pragmatic these days. I'll use it then, right? If they're going to find it compelling, I will use it. And so that's kind of my approach. So these are the three metaphysical arguments. We'll probably spend the next 3 times in these apologetics lessons going through each of these in depth. But tonight we're just going to use the teleological approach, the teleological argument. Now, John Frame says this about the teleological argument. He says, most of the arguments traditionally used in apologetics begin with some fundamental reality in the universe and try to show that that reality presupposes, implies, or somehow requires God, right? So most of these arguments say, hey, here's a thing that we recognize out there that's true, and most of us would grant that it's true at the outset. What is the necessary precondition for that to be true? God. That's how most of these arguments go. And so the teleological argument is the argument from purpose. And it essentially says that there is purpose or design out there in the universe. There's purpose or design out there in the world. What is the necessary precondition for there to be purpose and design out there in the world? God. And that's essentially the argument. Frame says the most common of these arguments is the teleological argument. It starts from purpose, from the concept of purpose, and then, of course, being and cause are the other two. Now, it's called the teleological argument. It comes from the Greek, telos, right? The Greek telos. And telos just means end or goal. End or goal. The end for which something is designed, the goal for which something is designed. I've talked about telos before in a sermon. It's been a long time, many years, I believe. And I talked about a big truck that has a lot of towing horsepower, right? The telos of that truck is to tow something. It's going to perform best when it's under load. That is the end or goal for which it is designed, and so when you put it in those conditions, it thrives, all right? That's the idea behind the telos or the teleological argument. So again, the argument is there's purpose and design out there in the world, out there in the universe. What is the necessary precondition to account for that? God, that's the argument. Go ahead.
I've seen an evangelist use like a children's book and ask questions of the person about who designed it, the author, all that kind of stuff. And then they go into like, so you believe that the world was just created without an author, essentially. And
yes.
like explaining like there must be some sort of intelligent design to make us the way that we are. There's a purpose, a design. Would you say that that would be a
Yes,
teleological
that
argument?
is the teleological argument. Yep, and we're going to be jumping into some specifics regarding that. William Lane Craig, in his book Reasonable Faith, says this: perhaps the oldest and most popular of all of the arguments for the existence of God is the teleological argument. It is the famous argument from design, and it infers an intelligent designer of the universe, just as we infer an intelligent designer for any product in which we discern evidence of a purposeful adaptation of means to some end or telos. Teleological argument. Let's go. This is going to be the only time I reference the Bible tonight because I'm sorry, apologetics can get philosophical at times. But Psalm chapter 8, verses 3 and 4, if somebody could read that for us. Psalm 8, 3 and 4.
When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him?
There you go. This is a fairly classic teleological assessment of the universe by the psalmist. He's looking at the majesty of God as evidence to him in the creation. He looks out at the creation, especially the heavens. They're the works of his hands. The moon, the stars, he set them in their place. And the psalmist essentially says, I look at the creation, I discern behind the creation a creator. It's a teleological argument. The author's not even trying to make an argument. They're just saying that that's kind of a natural proclivity I have when I look at the universe. Thomas Aquinas famously put it this way: we see unintelligent things working together for a purpose, and we generally attribute that to an intelligent designer. Teleological means pertaining to a purpose or a goal. And so that was essentially Aquinas' argument, right? Aquinas said the creation works together intelligently. It looks designed. That implies a designer. Now, one thing that John Frame notes, and I think he's right in this argument is very strong when it's used informally, okay? Just like the psalmist, all right? You, in fact, may intuit this argument already yourself. I've talked to many people who, they're like, yeah, I go out in nature, I look at the mountains and the sky and the stars, and I'm just amazed, I'm blown away, and I realize I'm so small and tiny, and there must be a God, right? Like, that's it. It's very intuitive, it's very informal, it's a very strong argument that way. But what's really funny about this argument is that it's actually relatively weak when you try to formalize it. When you try to put it in a series of, arguments, propositions with a logical conclusion at the end, it's really hard to get your arms around proving this in some sort of philosophical way. And the first question I want to ask you guys is, why do you think that is? Why do you guys think this argument is so strong when it's used informally, but then when you try to formalize it, it's really weak, actually?
I don't know what I'm talking about. So there
That's
you go.
the point.
But I wonder if, it feels strong because in the intuitive sense, we just sort of see things through relationships. And so when you consider the idea or concept of designer and how we relate to that in our practical life, it just feels like a very human concept and a very natural assumption. But you almost have to define designer, define, intent and all these things when you start to formalize it. And I think so much of that has these huge ranges of meaning, and they don't have to necessarily be intelligible. And I think that's maybe where maybe the semantics of it would break down potentially.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot there that I'm driving at. Good. Other thoughts? To get at a concept I talked about before, I think it illustrates the role of presuppositions, which is when you're talking about the semantics and trying to define everything, that's one of the keys here, right? I said at the beginning that all of these arguments have weaknesses, and it's because they rely on certain presuppositions. Well, it's really strong and intuitive for people to just be awestruck by creation and believe, wow, there's a God. But when you start to formalize it, when you start to define, when you start to look into all those things, you begin to realize like that awe produces belief concept breaks down in terms of a formalized argument. It's intuitive and we sense it, but I don't know if you guys have seen this, but there are many atheists out there who will wax poetic about how beautiful and vast the universe is and how amazingly small I am and all of this type of stuff. I'm thinking particularly of Carl Sagan. He has a pretty famous just bit where he's talking about how vast everything is, and he's a famous atheist, right? And he's in awe of the universe and how small he is in it, and yet he concludes atheism. So that intuitive thing doesn't necessitate that conclusion, and that's part of why these arguments can be weak. You can argue to Carl Sagan, look how vast and beautiful the universe is, look how amazing it is, aren't you awestruck? And he'd be like, absolutely. You'd be like, and you don't believe in God? He's like, no way. You know what I mean? And it's because of the role of presuppositions, right? And so I think that's an aspect that's important to recognize. I think it also illustrates the fickleness of trying to convince people. And this always needs to be borne in mind when we are talking about apologetics. A lot of people think that, man, especially when they get excited about the faith initially in their lives, they think, I'm just going to get armed with all of these arguments. The atheist will not be able to resist, and I'm just going to convert everyone I see. And the fact of the matter is, that won't do it, right? That won't do it. So if you go out there trying to convince somebody, you may or may not be successful. And it doesn't matter how good your arguments are, how strong your logic is. It doesn't matter any of that. It matters the Holy Spirit and whether or not he's going to change hearts. And so I think that also is illustrative here, just the fickleness of convincing people, and don't fall into that trap of thinking I've got to convince people or, that's the goal or the role here. That's part of why I said at the beginning, hey, sometimes these things can be really good for us. We dig into this, we think about it, and we go, that's right, I have good reasons for what I believe. And that can be reason enough to study apologetics. Although, again, I think if you're going to use any sort of classical argument for God's existence, the teleological is probably the best one, because most people are not trained philosophers, right?
I know this is needed a part of it, but to me, when I look, a stronger proof of God than just creation, I look at the human body. Scientists understand animals, plants, all these things, but they cannot explain the workings of the human body. To me, that, maybe not to somebody else, but to me, that is even a stronger proof than anything else. Just
Yes.
me.
No, absolutely. And these are all teleological sorts of arguments. So you bring up exactly where I wanted to go next. So we're talking about arguing informally, okay? And I want everyone to spend a little bit of time thinking about this. So informal arguments. Let's start with the stars, the planets. Let's start where the psalmist starts in Psalm chapter 8. Stars, planets, the cosmos in general. How would you just intuitively argue from this fact or this reality with an unbeliever to the existence of God? What would you do? How would you go about it?
I am no cosmologist or astronomer, but I feel like when you look at the magnitude and the delicate nature of what we understand outside of ourselves, you see the insane amount of balance needed, and it doesn't feel randomized, right? And so I think we kind of all intuit there's something extra happening here, and if you kind of dig into it, they talk about the God particle and how atoms are held together in ways that we can't quite understand, blah blah blah. But you don't have to know that to understand something is making everything hang together in such a way, including myself, like Shirley said, our human body is doing incredible stuff that can't be explained away. So it makes you wonder, what else is there than what we can empirically investigate? And I think if there's more than empiricism at work, then it makes way and room for perhaps there is a design element, right? Like it can't just be randomly construed together. And you can kind of go down that route. But I think just considering it from that material perspective is interesting and makes you wonder, like, okay, that seems like there's more to it than just, physical construct.
Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly the way these arguments go. Go ahead.
And if you take away the fact that they're saying that we've been around billions and billions of years, you've removed that, and they say, the Big Bang Theory, nothing like that has happened since. We haven't seen any change. Those things are still there. They're still in place. They're still working. And how can you ignore, as she said, how all this stays and works together? But then, people say, well, it took billions of years to do this, so we haven't been here long enough for anything to happen again. To me, if they believe that, okay. But it still comes back to what you said. Unless the Holy Spirit moves, no matter what you say, they're not going to be convinced.
Mm-hmm.
But I just, when you take that away, how can you say, how did it just happen and nothing has changed really since then?
Yeah.
It's all there, still in place in the same spot, same things happening, it still works the same way year after year. How do you ignore that?
Right. No, that's exactly right. There's that constancy in nature, that uniformity that we see out there where things are continuing, like you said, year after year in a similar fashion, implies a designer, right, behind everything. That's perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
This goes along with that implies a designer. If you start to press people, what's your other option? If there isn't a designer, what do you think happened? There are some really weird things that they come up with.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We're not there yet, but you talk about Big Bang and early. When we get into the cosmological argument, that is all in play, right? And that's an active part of the conversation. So it's funny from a teleological perspective, people think they're dodging by pointing to the Big Bang. But cosmologically, we would argue that that actually implies a designer also, irrespective of the time frame or whatever. And then the reason I bring that up, Christy, is to your point, what is the other option? Oftentimes, again, when we use the cosmological argument, we're trying to go back to the beginning, that first mover. And yeah, you'll hear all sorts of wild theories, aliens, seeded life on the planet, and all this other stuff. Even if that were the case, where did the aliens come from, right? Like that's where the cosmological argument brings into play, like the initial first mover, and many of these things can't be explained away.
Or if they go along with the Big Bang Theory, how did the stuff that the Big Bang created come from to begin with?
Right. Yep.
Well, and also why?
Right.
If we believe there's a creator, he has a purpose and a design in it. Why?
Yeah, it gets to the question of purpose or meaning. And Nietzsche famously argued that when we've killed God, right? If you remember Nietzsche's madman who ran around in the village square and he said, God, we've killed God, and everyone's like, what are you talking about? What Nietzsche was positing is we're going to lose all our purpose and meaning. If we don't have God, we don't have why, and if we don't have why, our lives are meaningless. And sure enough, after Nietzsche essentially said that, hundreds of years later, all of a sudden we live in a society where everybody lives as though their lives are purposeless and meaningless, right? Go ahead.
No, I got nothing.
Okay, sounds good. So good. I want to read you some quotes. You may not think of these as good Christian apologists. Plato. William Lane Craig says, according to Plato, there are two things that lead men to believe in the gods. That's Plato's approach. The argument based on the soul, and the argument, and this is a quote, from the order of the motion of the stars and of all things under the dominion of the mind which ordered the universe, end quote. So that's Plato. Plato's like, hey, you got to believe in the gods because of the stars and their ordered motion and how all of that works. It wasn't just Plato that said this. Again, another one you may not think as an ally to Christianity necessarily, but Aristotle. Aristotle says, for it is owing to their wonder that men both now begin and at first began to philosophize. They wondered originally at the obvious difficulties, then advanced little by little in stated difficulties about great matters, about the phenomena of the moon and of the sun and about the stars and about the genesis of the universe. So he's like, we as human beings started wondering about these things, and the moon and the sun and the stars caused us to wonder about where did the universe come from, right? That's Aristotle's argument. He continues. This one I think is interesting. Aristotle posits, what if we imagine a people who never saw the sky, right? They just lived underground their whole lives, and then they come out to see the sky, right? He says, when thus they would suddenly gain sight of the earth, the seas, and the sky, when they should come to know the grandeur of the clouds and of the might of the winds, when they should behold the sun and should learn its grandeur and beauty as well as its power to cause the day by shedding light over the sky. And again, when the night had darkened and the lands, and they should behold the whole of the sky spangled and adorned with stars. He goes on and on and on. When they should behold all these things, most certainly they would have judged both that there exist gods and that all these marvelous works are the handiwork of the gods. End quote. And so that's Aristotle and Plato both, you can see, are essentially arguing teleologically for the existence of, for them, gods, but still they're arguing that, man, when we look at the sky, the stars, the universe all around us, we must conclude that it was created by a creator, or for them, creators, okay? Now, we're talking about the sun, the sky, the stars. What else might you guys point to as a teleological argument? What else would you maybe point to or refer to?
The existence of natural hierarchy within creation. Just
Okay,
watching,
expand.
If you were to watch animal behavior or like the natural progression of societal, I don't know, systems,
Yep.
you see there's always a reordering of things.
Yep.
And it goes bottom up, top down, and it works all together. And you even see it like, yeah, when you look at the ordering of how planetary systems work, there's natural hierarchy. And I think hierarchy is a really interesting thing because it keeps drawing your gaze above, like what else is there and who's at the top. And so I think that's one thing that might point you towards some sort of deific mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. If you recognize the pattern of hierarchy in creation, well, where does that hierarchy naturally lead, right?
There's always a ruler of sorts, and
Right.
it's not inherently a bad thing. It's just designed that way. And
Yeah.
so you would kind of assume there's got to be one great ruler potentially then, right?
Yeah, good. What else?
Order, like things like that are like mathematics, order in nature, patterns that we see, tides, moons, all the things that have patterns and order.
Yeah, absolutely. Shirley, of course, earlier said the human body, right? I think that is a good one for sure. What else?
To go along with that, the human body can go under like birth.
Yes.
All that under human body.
Yep. Absolutely.
I also think beauty is a big one too, and it's hard because it's like intuitive and super subjective, but
this is the power of the teleological argument.
right.
It's often very intuitive and subjective, right? And so you can appeal to these things with this one.
Yeah, and I think, if you were just to reduce all of existence to functionality, and I think that that's kind of what evolutionary theory is arguing for, right? It's just pure functionality. There's no reason for beauty, period. It doesn't matter. And yet it's so key to our human existence. It's something we recognize and are constantly in awe of and express wonder about. There's an insane amount of creative diversity in what you see in flora and fauna in areas where there shouldn't even be a human eye, and yet it's there, and we don't really know why,
Yep.
I think beauty really points to something greater as well.
I was going to say just goodness in general. Anything that is good. If there is no God, why? That too.
Absolutely. And this often appeals to what's called the moral argument for the existence of God. It's not one of the standard three metaphysical ones, but it follows shortly thereafter. And
Also, when you look at the human being, why is there a feeling of guilt? Why is there a feeling of this is right or wrong? What makes you think that, even from a young age when you haven't been taught that? Something had to have been placed there for some purpose or some reason.
yeah,
Even like pain receptors in the brain, the physical.
absolutely. Good. These are all great ideas. I do want to hit on the animal and plant life that was brought up. This was actually Aquinas' argument. So we've got Plato and Aristotle. Aquinas is a very Christianized version of these. He's a favorite theologian of Roman Catholics, but even in our day and age, Protestants are really interested in Aquinas. He talks explicitly about the flora and fauna, animal and plant life. He talks about their variety. And one of the things he observes about the natural world is he says, everything operates towards some end, even when it lacks consciousness. Okay? So we have consciousness, and we often consciously choose to do a thing. But for Aquinas, everything out in nature works towards some common end, even though, like an animal is not actively, consciously choosing that end. It's as though creation itself operates with some sort of telos, i.e., the teleological argument. Put by William Lane Craig, summarizing Aquinas, he says, a modern example is poppy seeds always grow into poppies. Acorns always grow into oaks. It's not as though the seed is deciding or choosing to do that. That's the telos that seed has. It naturally fulfills it. Aquinas reasons, according to William Lane Craig, that even if it lacks consciousness, it tends towards a goal unless, he says, even if it lacks consciousness, it tends towards a goal. And he says, this is not possible unless there is an intelligence driving that. The way he puts it, an arrow does not tend towards the bullseye unless it is aimed there by the archer. So why is the acorn turning into an oak? The archer is directing it to do so. That is God. This individual has to be somebody with intelligence for Aquinas. They have to actively be directing it, and that is God. So even animal, plant life, it's not just the vastness of the stars in the sky, but also even animal and plant life for Aquinas has a telos. And he says this implies the archer who shot the arrow towards the bullseye. So this is the teleological argument in a nutshell, and how to argue it kind of informally, okay? Before we move forward, I want to talk about some implications of it. I want to ask you guys, put on your good atheist hats, okay? What are some challenges to the teleological argument? What are the sorts of things you can think of that would punch holes in this argument? If you're trying to bring this up with your friends or your family members, your coworkers, what are the sorts of things you think they would say to try and defeat your teleological argument?
One that I have heard pretty recently, because it's June, is that nature is gay.
Okay.
Gay.
So if you are in any, if you're in any of the arguments surrounding the LGBT movement, etc., there is an implicit assumption that what is natural is good and what is unnatural is bad. And so they will point to instances of animals being gay in nature, and therefore the implication is, so that's natural, so that's good, so you Christians are wrong because you're going against nature, right? So it's the inherent, nature goes against your we'll call it ethics, for Christians. That's the idea. So it's almost like a reverse teleological argument, right? We say, look at how nature is so beautiful and grand and vast. Doesn't that prove God? Well, this argument is, yeah, look how nature itself has different values than you Christians have. So it's like a reverse teleological argument, right? We'll get into this, but this is actually there's a formal word to describe this. It's called dysteleology, right? And we'll get into it here momentarily.
Another argument I've heard is, why do I need a creator to create meaning when I can create meaning for myself? That's actually what we're supposed to do. Is the grand human adventure is use this life that you have, this one life, to make your own meaning. You don't need to get it from some outside source.
Yeah, this is the famous philosophical argument surrounding existentialism. So if you guys study Jean-Paul Sartre or other existentialists, there's a question of what comes first? Your meaning, which is essentially the Christian position, right? Like meaning is derived from God. He created us in his image, and so therefore we are meant to aspire towards a certain ends. The existentialists posited that no, we come first, and therefore we create our own meaning and our own purpose, right? Like you don't have a meaning or a purpose that's chosen for you at the outset that you ought to strive towards. Instead, you exist in a vast sea of nothingness, and you have to choose your own purpose and your own meaning. And for Sartre, this actually meant that man was the greatest kind of human being, and he reached his fullest potential by defining his own meaning and his own purpose. Now, I want to be clear, not all existentialists are bad, because that sounds really bad when I describe Sartre and his approach. There are really good existentialists out there as well, Christian existentialists, but that's essentially the idea, is that we create our own purpose or meaning, and so we don't need inherent meaning, right? Good. What else?
I don't know that this is an argument against teleology or not, but
Sure.
When we talk about order and pointing there's a purpose and a plan, and it's clearly a creator, there are people who would point to abnormalities, disorder. What about, all the people who turn out just fine, and then the person who lives life in a wheelchair without speaking or seeing or hearing or anything, and they would point out all the abnormalities, maybe kind of with the, first part, the nature goes against your ethics. Like,
Yes.
what if there's disorder? What if nature
Yeah.
doesn't follow the rules sometimes?
And so with what you're bringing up, there are kind of two arguments there. First is the dysteleology, like you're talking about. But then there's also that it's almost an argument against God through the existence of evil. Because oftentimes people will appeal to this and say, why is that little child born and is confined to a wheelchair all the days of their life, right? And they point to that as a loving God would never allow that to happen. And so you not only have a dysteleology in that nature gets messed up, but you also have a good God would never do that.
And with that, it's I actually knew someone who was like that, and their doctor said it's actually, in his mind, points more towards a creator that more people aren't that way. Because of all the millions of things that have to go perfectly right in creating a human life, the fact that most of us are normal or okay or or don't have these crazy wrong things, it goes back to the presupposition. In his mind, that proves that there is a God, because we should all be abnormal in crazy ways.
We're going to talk about this at the end, but that's also referred to as the argument from fine-tuning, right? And so we'll get into that at the end, but that's absolutely a really strong case, right?
Going off the abnormalities, I think they would often point to little circumstances, like God would make that situation or that person, there wouldn't be that imperfection, right? The perfect God would make things perfect.
Yep.
And it's not perfect.
Good. Other thoughts?
Maybe the people who believe there is no purpose.
Right.
Their argument is like, yeah, who cares about anything?
right? And oftentimes that's kind of where the existentialists are coming from. Either you need to create your own meaning or there isn't any meaning, right?
And then when you look at the abnormalities that they're talking about, in my mind, of course, that's because I believe in God and they don't. But then you're throwing away the sin factor. That's what brought about some of these things. But if they don't believe in God, then they don't consider the sin factor and why human nature and human man fails sometimes and things don't work out the best.
Yeah, that's key, and I'm glad you brought that up. You know, the Christian system has room for a creation that it isn't perfect. But oftentimes, and this is what's so funny, when you start doing apologetics, oftentimes you end up doing theology with the individual who doesn't understand theology, because they think, in their mind, they know nothing about Christianity. Pretend you know nothing about Christianity, right? Really hard for us who spend our lives trying to study the Bible, understand more about God, etc. But if you knew nothing about Christianity, it might naturally make sense to you that a perfect God would not allow imperfections in the world. And you might say that. And then a Christian, and they say, yeah, but there was a fall, there was sin entered the world, etc. Now you're doing theology, right? And what you're trying to do is explain to them how within the Christian system, we can account for abnormalities, we can account for the imperfections. That's part of the case that we're making, right? But many times, you know, it's really difficult for people to understand that. I'm going to read a quote from John Frame on this. I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but he says this. He says, between the world and the products of human design, on a Christian view, the world is something like an object of human design because it is designed, but it is also unlike such objects because it is the product of a divine design. Thus, dysteleology actually favors the Christian conclusion. What's he saying? This happens because of the fall, right? He says even the existence of evil can be listed among the evidences for Christianity, right? The evidence, both apparent teleology and apparent dysteleology, is what we would expect if the world was planned and made by a transcendent God. So he argues, no, these things actually argue for Christianity, but you have to know a bit about Christian theology for that to make any sense. Otherwise, people aren't going to get it, right? And so oftentimes in apologetics, you are educating people on what a biblical worldview is, what a biblical worldview looks like. You're doing theology with them to help them understand, right? Very good point. There's a few others, and I just want to walk through some of these. David Hume argued, and this is really funny given some of the quotes we've read. David Hume argued that the teleological argument doesn't prove a single eternal God. And he says it could be the product of lesser deities, and some of them have creative duties. Well, I mean, that's pretty much what Plato and Aristotle said, right? Like that was their assumption. So Hume's point is even if I were to grant the teleological argument, I could become a Greek or Roman pagan, right? Like with that conclusion. And here's the point. He's not necessarily wrong. There's a reason that teleology found its, start with Plato and Aristotle in many ways. But an argument back against that would be, okay, who created those deities, right? Like if you want to say those deities created, who created them, right? Now we're back in the cosmological argument. We have to go to that initial mover, the first mover. So that's an interesting one. Now, another one, because teleology argues for a purpose, right? It's an argument about this is its purpose, this is its telos, right? Somebody might argue this way. They might say, well, we've never seen something made from nothing, so you say God created everything out of nothing. That's what we were talking about earlier. They might say, how would we know what it should or should not look like? You see what I mean? How would we know what it should or should not be designed for? You want to argue from design, but we've never seen its equivalent. So how do you know that is its design, right? Or another way to put it, we don't know how something is made from nothing, and so we wouldn't be able to recognize it anyway, right? Again, you can see some of these are getting very philosophical in a way. Now, I do want to spend a moment on this dysteleology idea, because it relies upon certain characteristics of God, and namely that God is omniscient, He's omnipotent, and He is omnibenevolent, right? And that's the all-loving or all-good piece. The idea here is, just like we were talking about earlier, God wouldn't allow these imperfections to happen for one of these qualities or characteristics. Okay? How would you respond to this if somebody said, well, your God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and there is disorder or imperfection in the universe? So what if they were to argue, well, then your God is not any of these things? What would you say to that? Like I said, you end up doing theology a little bit. Sure. Omniscient means all-knowing. So God knows and sees everything. So you can't say, well, evil exists in the world because God is ignorant, right? No, He knows everything. God is omnipotent. That's all powerful. So they're arguing, you can't say God doesn't fix it because He's not powerful enough to do so, right? He's strong enough to do it, okay? And then omnibenevolent is essentially all good. You can't say He can't fix it because he's not good enough to do it. So they're saying essentially these three attributes of God mean this conclusion is valid for them, right? They essentially conclude that God can't be all three of these things and the world be as it is.
I think this is where I would lose them, because I would probably say, well, all of life is story, and God, if you think of God as being the greatest storyteller, every narrative arc requires some element of tension and climax, and the author can be all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good with their characters unto a greater end that we just don't understand is coming, and the tension, the imperfections that we perceive are part of the necessary friction for the greatest sort of redemption and narrative possible. And like, you resonate with that in your imaginings of literature, right? A flat, straight story is not a story. And yet, we gravitate towards that. So why couldn't an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God be working all things towards some greater end that we can't quite conceive of because we're in this particular snapshot? And I think they would be like, you're totally illogical, and I don't understand what you're talking about.
So I think you're correct that most would respond that way, but let's pretend I do understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
I would suspect that most would respond this: then your God is not all good because He prioritizes His story over suffering. What's your answer now?
I would say, since when is suffering all bad? I think that the physician understands that some degree of suffering is necessary for your greatest good. How do you have room for that? And then they would say, I don't want to talk to you anymore. This coffee date is over.
But notice how much theology you're relying on here.
Yeah,
and I'm not criticizing this. Like, it's part of the worldview. Like, you assume there is good that comes out of suffering. You assume that because you're a Christian and you understand the Christ narrative deeply. But most human beings don't resonate with that because we flee from suffering in our sin.
Unless you're an athlete, though, too, and I think Ryan could totally pop off on this, but like, I think most athletes understand that if you're going to actually train, if you're going to be disciplined, you go through a intentional and deliberate and strategic suffering process to expand your body. Like, that's how muscles work. You tear them down and then you build them back up. It's built into our cellular formatting. So if suffering's built into us in that level, why couldn't it be built into the meaning level as well, right? And I don't know, again, I would not finish that coffee date well.
It's good. Again, you're departing from traditional apologetics, and I think it's good, right? But you're going to lose people who don't resonate with these sorts of narratives. But I think our population is increasingly becoming that way. There's a reason Jordan Peterson is so intriguing to people these days, and he talks about patterns and narratives constantly. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering how the Christian should answer this question to another Christian. How can God be all good and have there be evil? And isn't that God's glory is His highest priority? So all those things are ultimately pointing that way. And maybe I would try to explain to someone like, hey, that's a really tough concept, but it kind of comes down to that all good one is a really tricky thing, because we think good is just being like what's easy, what's nice. Yeah, and God's ultimate aim is glorifying himself. And so that's why his ways are above our understanding. So there might be some of these tragedies, but ultimately the Christian trusts that the greatest glory is going to be to our greatest benefit. Now, you're not a Christian, so you might not understand that, but that's my answer to be consistent, kind of. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's right even as a Christian to say that, though.
Well, you're going to lose Arminians, right? So that's a very Calvinistic, apologetic way to approach things, right?
But
So-
doesn't an Arminian also think that God wants to glorify himself?
Well, they would argue that free will is the disruptor here. So, for example, like a follow-up argument. So, okay, the world is the way it is because it maximizes the glory of God. An Arminian would come back very, very quickly, and they'd point out something that is just horrifically, horrendously evil out there in the world, and I'm sure you can think of something, and they would say, how does that glorify God, right? And so that's an Arminian arguing against you as Christian against Christian, right? So that would be one response. The atheist would probably argue, well, God is megalomaniacal, right? Like he is just, you know, all he cares about is himself and his own glory, etc. And to your point, like if you're not a Christian, you're really going to struggle with the idea that all ends are to the glory of God, right? But even Christians, Arminians, are going to struggle with that idea too, right?
Well, but okay, I guess there's a few things there. Isn't an Arminian still thinking that all things are happening for God's glory, or do they not? They just don't think that.
No.
Okay.
The world is the way it is because of free will. So the honestly, so an Arminian apologist, I think William Lane Craig argues almost this exact point. He says the world is the way it is because it maximizes the salvation of individuals while still respecting their free will. So God created he actualized a universe in which the most people could, by their free will choice, be saved. That's not God's glory, right? Like it's a very different. It's maximizing God's respecting of the free will of individuals and trying to get as many of them saved as possible, right? That's a completely different. I suppose William Lane Craig would say, and that glorifies God the most, but he's building free will into the framework, right? So no, an Arminian would not agree.
There's got to be more threads in there too. I mean, my brother's like a really big free will guy, but he would definitely go, yeah, like glory. Ultimately, these things are happening. So, but I don't want to hang it too much on that. I guess going back to to an unbeliever, yeah, I'm losing them to some degree, but I'm also just kind of going, hey, this is this viewpoint, that the Christian might have. So I'm answering your question from my belief of here's how all those things can be possible, and this world exists. If they want to reject that, that's fine. But I guess I'm just trying to defend the faith to some degree. I'm wondering if that's even right. I was kind of wondering if there was a different answer that a Christian should have or ought to have, or other Christian answers even.
Well, it depends on what you are prioritizing, right? So I think Calvinists often want to convert people to Calvinist Christianity, right? And so that second approach that you described is that, Calvinists often don't see stepping stones to coming to faith. It's like you're either going to agree and believe or you're not, and they have that because we believe strongly in the total depravity of man and that the Holy Spirit is required to, transform somebody and they become a new creature. And so unless regeneration happens, they're not going to accept it anyway. So let me just declare the gospel explicitly, and they're either going to accept or reject. But if you believe in any sort of stepping stone approach to belief, then you probably shouldn't try to convert people to Calvinistic Christianity in one fell swoop, right? That would be Van Til's approach, right? Like absolutely, it's very presuppositional in nature, but it doesn't allow, I think, for a stepping stone approach to belief, right? Because you're just giving them the whole hog, right? Like this is this is a hard saying, Lord. How can we believe it, right? Well, yeah, perhaps. Other thoughts or ideas? Okay, so again, this argument from Teleology. A practical example of this is vestigial organs. Who's heard of this? It's not popular these days, but the argument used to be that there are organs in the human body that we don't need anymore. demonstrate there's product of our evolutionary past, right? So the most famous one that would be brought up for a long time was the appendix, right? Like you don't need your appendix, you can live without your appendix, and so it's vestigial, Maybe we used our appendix way back in our evolutionary past, but we don't need it anymore, and so, yeah, it's a vestigial organ, right? And it's an example of dysteleology, and, they would essentially say, we have these organs that are suboptimal and we don't need them. And they're trying to argue against, again, the creator God. But just like you guys said earlier, the fall can account for any sort of dysteleology that you want to posit, right? It's not as though dysteleology inherently says that these things can't happen. Again, Christian theology has this idea, and I think you guys are hitting the nail on the head on this all good thing. We assume that if God is all good, he's going to act a certain way that makes sense to us. But there's a certain arrogance in that, right? That we say God is going to act a certain way because that's how we would act if we were all good. Well, hold on a second, right? So very, very interesting. One other one before we start to move towards our conclusion here is the idea of random chance in billions of years, right? So for many, random chance in billions of years, can account for a lot. And this is famously attributed to Thomas Huxley. He didn't actually say this, but a lot of people have followed up with this idea. If you gave me an infinite number of monkeys tapping away at an infinite number of typewriters, they'll eventually produce the complete works of Shakespeare, right? The idea being random chance, long periods of time, we're going to get there eventually. So all of your teleology, right? Random chance over long periods of time, that's how we got everything here, right? It is funny. They actually did this as an experiment. There were students from University of Plymouth, and they went to a zoo, and they got 6 monkeys to type on 6 typewriters. They did it for a month. The monkeys did not produce Shakespeare. They actually didn't get one word. They couldn't get a single word. They typed away for a month, 6 monkeys on 6 typewriters, typed away for a month, and they couldn't get a single English word. So, yeah. We just need more years, more time. We'll get there eventually.
Or they need to take a math class.
There you go, right. There you go. So you guys highlighted a lot of the key questions that would come up. Now, this is where, again, we're going with a very intuitive approach here. William Paley came up with probably the most classical enunciation of the teleological argument. And this is his watchmaker argument, right? The idea, he says, I'm going to summarize here. This is incredible. He wrote this in 1804 in his book called Natural Theology. It's actually really good and still relevant even to this day. He summarized, says, if we're walking on the beach and we find a watch that's sitting in the sand, we would not assume that it washed up on the shore after being formed through natural processes in the sea, right? Like, some natural processes in the sea happened to create this thing, and it washed up on the shore, right? Like, this is a natural thing. Instead, he says, we would assume that it had been lost by its owner, and that somewhere there was a watchmaker who designed it and built it for the purpose of telling time. And that's like a really good statement of the teleological argument, right? A watch implies a watchmaker, right? And William Paley put this out there. But part of the reason I had us go through this exercise first is Paley then also goes on to refute some classical arguments against teleology. And I want to read these to you, and I'm going to go through them pretty rapid fire. But he responds to the criticisms, and I think it makes a lot of sense when you think through his argumentation. This conclusion, Paley concludes, this conclusion that the watch implies a watchmaker, would not be weakened if we never actually had seen a watch being made, right? So if we go back to what I was talking about before, well, we didn't see the creation of the world from nothing. Well, we didn't see the watch being made by the watchmaker, and yet we can still conclude there was a watchmaker. He says, we recognize the remains of ancient art as the products of intelligent design without ever having seen such things be made. You see something created by human beings of the past, you recognize immediately that there was a creator. Or products of modern manufacture are the result of intelligence, even though we have no inkling as to how they're produced. Nor would our conclusion be invalidated if the watch sometimes went wrong, right? This whole argument over here, right? The purpose of the mechanism would be evident even if the machine did not function perfectly, right? Well, that's what we find in a world that's created by God and fallen. Nor would the argument seem uncertain if we were to discover some parts of the mechanism didn't seem to have any purpose. Vestigial organs, right? For this would not negate the purposeful design of the other parts. Nor would anyone in his right mind think that the existence of the watch was accounted for by the consideration that it was one out of many possible configurations of matter, and that some possible configuration had to exist in the place where the watch was found, i.e., random chance, billions of years, right? Like eventually a watch would just, form on its own. Nor would it help to say that there exists in things a principle of order which yielded the watch, i.e., the ordering principle just already exists out there in nature. There is no designer. For no one ever knows a watch to be so formed, and the notion of such a principle of order that is not intelligent seems to have little meaning. Nor is it enough to say the watch was produced from another watch before it, and from one prior to that watch, and so forth into infinity, right? Again, the Big Bang, right? Like, for the design is still unaccounted for. Where did it start from, right? That's the question. Each machine in the infinite series evidences the same design. It is irrelevant whether one has 10, 1,000, or an infinite number of such machines, a designer is still needed, right? End quote. So he kind of addresses all of these with his simple watchmaker analogy. Go ahead.
I just have a question. So with the whole nature thing, I think like the person I talked to, we can't get past it because she doesn't even believe in the fall. And so when is it just like, let's agree to disagree and move on? Because, we can just go around and around for days.
So all I would say, and we would get to this if we were doing the moral argument, so is does not apply ought, if that makes sense. So just because something is the case doesn't mean it ought to be the case one way or the other. So irrespective of belief in the fall, right, just simple logic says just because you observe something in nature does not mean that it ought to be the case. Show her a video of a lion tearing a gazelle to shreds and ask her, is this moral? Is this the way things ought to be? Should it be this way, right? And she'd probably be, no. Well, then it's nature, therefore it's good argument doesn't fly, right? So again, for Christians, we have the fall as our theological explanation for a reality that, evidences things aren't the way they should be, but she doesn't even need that, right? Is does not imply ought. You can't derive moral principles from just the facts or the reality of things. That's not where morals come from, period, right? She's probably not going to find that convincing, but it's just true. Like,
I don't want to derail things.
No, go ahead.
But I have a question too.
Mhm.
If you're like trying to take the watchmaker argument and parallel it to human experience, like on an individual level,
Yep.
how do you answer the question for somebody positively in terms of, okay, so I understand the telos of the watch is telling time. What's my telling time? You know what I mean? Like, because I feel like I can go my whole life and never be able to articulate that and never feel like I understand my design or what I'm here for.
Sure.
Like I can't answer the meaning question. I can't map that out. And I see a lot of other people floundering too. And it just feels like we're just existing, and we're trying our best, but I really don't know what I'm made for. And how would you explain that? And it's hard because I think from like the Christian systematic perspective, well, of course, to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Okay, what is that?
Sure.
Thank you, you answered everything abstractly, and then we just get more abstract and more abstract and more abstract. Like, how do you do that? I guess you can tell I'm coming from this like space of story and narrative. Like I am a storyteller. That's my job. But like, how do you resonate with somebody when you're like, this is your telling time?
Yeah. Well, what I would simply say is, from a pragmatic perspective, how's it working out for you, right? So if you want to take the existentialist approach and define your own meaning and your own purpose and all that type of stuff, like if we truly believe the Shorter Catechism question 1, then it ought to work in the world. You see what I mean? And if you live your life creating your own meaning and purpose, how's that working out for you? And if you live your life following the Westminster Shorter Catechism question 1, how's that working out for you, right? Like, go ahead.
Well, and I guess my question is, in the church, are we doing that? Like, are we doing that well?
No, I don't think so, but I think it's because we put head above hands, right? And so we're so concerned about getting our theology right that we don't actually functionally live the ways that our theology would imply. And so we're just as depressed and anxious as the world, right? But it's because we don't do what Jesus commanded. We just create a system of beliefs that seems to espouse Jesus at the center, but he's conveniently on the shelf for Sundays only.
Yeah, I feel like this is my biggest hang up with apologetics, to be honest, is that it's really easy, or sometimes it seems really easy, to just argue people to some sort of consistent system or a great answer. But unless you invite somebody into your living it out and show them, like, look, this, at the end of the day, it kind of boils down to experience here. Like, and this is what I have found it means to glorify God in my life. And I don't know what that's going to look like for you, but I will walk side by side with you, and we can figure this out together. Like, I just don't know how we do this practically unless that's what we're doing. And I don't think that's what a lot of Western evangelicalism is trying to promote necessarily. I think we like the idea of abstract discipleship and just bringing people into the church, and the truth will change you. But, man, I'm going to get us fired. I just feel like you really have to show people on a case-by-case, human-to-human level what it means, like why this even matters. You know what I mean? And I just don't think a lot of us do that work.
Yeah, I mean, tune into my forthcoming book to be published in 2030.
I'm going to ask a little bit what we're made for, created for, because I was wondering if this is tied into, like, if I'm talking to an unbeliever, like having them go, look at the things that make you a human, and you, and how you can, like, enjoy things and hear things, and like, I don't know what I'm trying to get at, kind of the whole Joe Rigney, like, strangely bright idea of, like, every human, whether you're a believer or not, has this ability to taste the deliciousness of a ice cream cone and enjoy that kind of magnificence of a sunset or whatever, and, like, maybe we are these, like, vessels of being able to take in some of these pleasures that God's created, and then sort of point them in this direction of, like, those are not as rich and deep as enjoying. This is not the one conversation, right? But, like, kind of going, hey, I know what it feels like to win or to take this in, but there's something missing here, and there will always be something missing. And then the pragmatic proof is in the pudding. If someone's kind of like, yeah, how's it working out for me to not believe in God? Pretty well. I'm super wealthy. I love my life, so I'm not really hearing your argument. Then it's kind of like going, yeah, but there's something missing, right? There is. Like, there's this satisfaction, fulfillment side, and maybe they would be able to take that in the same way that, like, yeah, that sunset's pretty good, but it's not, like, all-encompassing good, you know? But that's what we are as watchers. We're, like, vessels to enjoy God, and so we have to point them to see that. I don't know. I don't know if I'm going around in circles.
All right.
Your thoughts?
Why are you looking at me?
Because he's responding to you, so does any
no,
of that resonate? Is that
I-
what you're getting at?
I think in some ways, yes, yes, because I feel like there are a lot of things that we're just trying to understand ultimately, like, what we're here for, and we already talked about, like, beauty can point to that, like delight, like order, all these things, right? Like, we have patterns in our creative nature in terms of, like, I mean, The Giver, if you've ever read The Giver, like, the way that when you read that and you see color again for the first time in your mind, and you go, oh yeah, that's an incredible part of being human. I'm sorry for all you colorblind people. Like, there's a point there where you're like, I'm made for something that's so much more than just efficiency and pure functionality. And it seems to point to, like, meaning is more than that. And that's cool. And I think that's a great point of resonance. But part of me feels like, I think when we enter into the realm of apologetics, like, the teleological argument has so much cool possibility. I feel like it's poorly applied, typically. That doesn't mean it's a bad argument. I just think that we don't wield this tool very well.
But I think it's that we've changed. I think in its day and age, it was adapted for its time and its people. Again, Paley wrote in 1804, we're coming out of the Enlightenment. You have people like Plato and Aristotle are very unique in terms of their, context. They're very unlike the modern men of their day, And so in a society that's searching for rationalistic argumentation for God, I think teleology is applied commensurate to the people of its day. But I think what you're identifying...
I think that's where I'm going, is like, I feel like we have a false rationality at this point. We've like done a whole life cycle post-enlightenment of, we used to focus on the material and that used to make sense to us. And that's why a watch and a watchmaker was like, that's crazy logical. I love it. And now it's like, no, we've gone beyond the realm, like with the postmodern mindset is a weird one. And I think trying to find and define meaning for people now looks a little bit different than just look at the material patterning around you. There's a designer, right? I think people are like, I design shoes for cats, and that feels really important to me. So you tell me what design is and what meaning is, and I'll tell you something completely absurd and say it's also valid, I don't know if shoes for
You're
cats
good.
exist. But
Moving on. I've only got 10 minutes.
Okay.
Moving on. I want to talk about two things in brief here at the end. First is fine-tuning. This is also called the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle. And it is that the universe is created in such a way that there's too many things lined up for human life to exist. It can't be a coincidence. That's the idea. So the way that it's put by some is if you turned the knobs of the universe just slightly, it would make human existence impossible. So the four fundamental forces of physics, the strong and weak nuclear forces, gravity, electromagnetism, they're all perfectly balanced to yield the elements necessary for life. One author points out, if the strong nuclear force, constant, were any larger, there would be no hydrogen in the universe, none, and life would be unsustainable. If the electromagnetic force constant were any larger or smaller, chemical bonding would be insufficient. It wouldn't work, right? Just basic building blocks of our reality. If the gravitational force constant were larger, the stars would be too hot. They would burn quickly and unevenly. And if it were smaller, it would be too cool for nuclear fusion, and it wouldn't produce the heavier elements necessary for life as we know it, right? So, like, if you just look at kind of basic building blocks of life, everything seems fine-tuned to support human life, right? They go on... I think it was Stephen Hawking, he says, the remarkable fact is that the values of all of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life, right? This is too much to be a coincidence, And again, if you get enough monkeys and you get enough typewriters and you get a long enough period of time, well, suppose that's the universe that'll get spit out. But obviously, we don't think that is sufficient. All the knobs have been set precisely. Touching them would make the existence of the cosmos impossible. Now, this, of course, does not prove the existence of God, but it does present circumstances in which belief in an intelligent designer is at least reasonable, right? The universe may exist by a very lucky accident, but affirming that with any confidence would have to be an act of faith. Again, end quote. So that's the fine-tuning argument, right? There's one more. It's become very popular in our day and age. It's called irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity. Michael Behe wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box, right? And in it, he argues that there are too many systems in the human body that are irreducibly complex. And he goes to chemistry and things like that. But what is irreducible complexity? Evolutionary theory posits that there were small changes over time, like we adjusted this thing slightly, and then over and over we went from like this thing to a greater thing through small changes over time. What Behe argues is there are some things that exist in the human body that are irreducibly complex. You can't put them together in a piecemeal parts fashion, right? He talks about a simple example of a mousetrap. That's his classical example. A mousetrap, he says, doesn't function to trap mice unless like 5 mechanisms on the mousetrap all exist simultaneously. So if you didn't have the spring or the arm or the platform or the bait or, all of it has to exist at once. You take the spring away, the mousetrap doesn't function anymore. You take the arm away, the mousetrap doesn't function anymore. It's not as though like you start with a square platform, and then we add a spring, and then over millions of years we add an arm, and then over millions of years we add a trap, right? Like, No, the mousetrap would have died because the system doesn't work. And his argument is you have systems in your body that are irreducibly complex. He says many molecular biological systems are irreducibly complex. The removal of one of their components necessarily causes the loss of the system's function. So your whole system has to come online at once. It's not as though you can add, he talks about the clotting of blood, right? It's not as though you can add a little piece here, a little piece there, a little piece there, and over millions of years we finally have blood that can clot. No, we would have bled out by now. You need the system to come online all at once. He talks about blood clotting. He talks about the bacterial flagellum, right? Like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen it. There's a bacteria, and they have a little, propeller on their back so they can scoot around. That little propeller has so many systems that need to work together. You take away one component of it, the propeller doesn't work at all, and the bacteria can't get around, right? Intracellular support, it requires a ton of systems to be interchangeable and work together all at once. He says a common strategy in molecular biology is to identify required components of a system and to knock it out or render it inoperative to see if the system fails. If it does fail, it is an irreducibly complex system, right? And he says the human body just has way too many irreducibly complex systems. Therefore, they could not have evolved piecemeal. They all have to come online at once. And so that's the argument from irreducible complexity, right? So there you go. There is a lot to the teleological argument. I think Jess is right. I think this argument can be very powerful. And it's intuitive for many people, You don't have to get into irreducible complexity or fine-tuning. If you'd like to, and you have somebody who wants to go there, that's fine. But we'll get into the ontological and cosmological arguments, and those get very philosophical and very confusing. Most untrained people can't even follow a cosmological argument. But the teleological argument just is intuitive. It makes a lot of sense to people. Again, the psalmist, Psalm 8, states the teleological argument, and so I think there's a lot of value in it.
I'm just curious because I know in your faith journey, you've done a lot of evangelism and apologetic work in a variety of contexts. Can you think of any instances where you've actually gotten the opportunity to speak to the teleological argument with a non-believer?
Yes. So I remember I was outside of our student union in Reno, and I was there with a group who was doing some open-air preaching and evangelism, and I got in a side conversation with an individual and his friend. They came up and they were talking, right? And we got into the argument of teleology and creation and design and designer, etc. And it was interesting. I had one person grant essentially the teleological argument after the conversation. They were both avowed atheists, but one person said, "No, that makes sense, and I believe what you're saying about the teleological argument," right? They didn't believe, right? They basically said, "Yeah, there's more going on in the universe than we recognize, and I don't think God necessarily explains it," right? But yeah, I understand, your argument from teleology, right? And then the other just flat denied it, right? He kept arguing vehemently, "No, doesn't make sense." So it was interesting. The two of them were friends, but one agreed with me, and then one didn't agree with me. Neither of them believed. So, I've had a handful of situations. I've never, I don't think, used the cosmological argument in a way that I've used it before, but I've gotten to a point where people, I'm still like, "Oh, you don't understand it." You know what I mean? And then the ontological argument is super philosophical. I've never used it with an individual in reality. So, yep. Good. Other thoughts, questions, comments, concerns?
I think going back to your point at the beginning, it's such an encouragement just as a believer, like you're saying too. Even if in practice this isn't something that necessarily is going to convince people, and again, that's not our goal, that's the Holy Spirit's work, but we want to be able to have an answer, right? That's great, but it's so nice to know that we actually have an answer for ourselves, right? And I do think that that's one side of apologetics that continues to be a neat component of you don't have to check your head at the door. You can actually ask the hard questions, and the truth stands, and these sort of ideas and systems work. And yes, there's mystery to everything, and that's why I think there's still, like you're saying, holes to the arguments and weaknesses, etc. But you have to have faith in the mystery.
Sure.
And you can still be logical, you can still be philosophical, you can still be intellectual and go, yeah, okay, this works.
Yeah.
So, cool.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think a lot of Christians nowadays are nervous that their faith is irrational, And the fact is, it's not. Some of the strongest philosophers in the world believe in God, right? Maybe not scientists, but they'll catch up eventually. It's just going to take them some time. So I think that's absolutely true. I think it's the case. And that can be encouraging because many of us came to Christ not through some sort of philosophical argument, but then once we got here, we got concerned that maybe my faith isn't rational. It is, and that can be an encouragement. So, anybody else? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pray. Father God, we thank you so much for this time we can spend together, and we thank you as we consider these ideas, this reality, Lord. Please help us, God, to remember these things, to think upon these things, and I pray also you would give us good encouragement for ourselves in our own faith, and you give us opportunities to share some of these ideas with others as we go out in the world and we seek to live gospel lives that would glorify and honor you. Thank you for all you've done for us, Lord. Please be with us this evening, the rest of this week and weekend. Pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. You're dismissed. Thank you.